Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here and grateful for the opportunity to share with you. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, and I was not in any way interested in academic things. You'll have to take this completely by faith now, but I was an athlete back then. And my interest in academics was only in staying eligible. I didn't know how to spell it, but it meant everything to me. So I went on to college, but at the beginning of my freshman year, I became a Christian. I heard the gospel. I read through the Bible that year because I felt it was a book I should know if I'm a Christian, and my mind woke up. I started sharing the gospel with friends because I thought everybody in the world would want to know that they could leave behind the insecurities of trying to understand who they are by looking at how other people perceive them, and understand instead how they are by virtue of how God perceived them, and God loved them and did everything to reconcile them into relationship with Him, forgiving their sins at great cost. I don't understand why a person wouldn't be intrigued by that message. As I would share Christ with people, they would ask questions. I didn't know the answers to the questions, and I would see in the literature the name C.S. Lewis popping up. I started reading to give answers to my friends, but my older sister was teaching 5th grade, and she was a Christian, and she was reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to her 5th grade students, and she told me the story of that book, and I was intrigued. I went and bought the set of the Narnian Chronicles, and that was my first exposure to Lewis, but those weren't the books that hooked me. I read Surprised by Joy afterwards. And when Lewis talked about the deep longing of the heart and the quest for the object of this longing, that book gave me a vocabulary to my own soul, and I started reading Lewis voraciously after that. When I graduated from college, a friend wisely said, "You do not get an education in college. All you do is lay a foundation for one." And commencement means you will now commence your education by building on that foundation. Pick an author who will take you places and make that author your life study. I picked Lewis. And I started reading him and discovered that he opens more than wardrobe doors. 73 books, 11 literary genres. He wrote one book called English Literature in the 16th Century, excluding drama. And to write that book, he read every book written in English in the 16th century. He read every book translated into English, whether it be translated from the Latin, from the Old French, or Old Italian, and he would read it in the original and in translation. Again, this underscores, that's just one of 73 titles, how wide-ranging he is and the doors he opens up. In our time together this weekend, we want to look at just one of his books, Screwtape Letters. And the way I've tried to set our lectures out 6 times together, I want to look at first the background for this book and what Lewis was trying to do in speaking of rich and complex themes in fiction, a literary fiction. I want to next look at hell, the doctrine of hell, or at least a Lewisian understanding of hell, so that we could understand the background from which the letters are written. And then I want to look at 3 major themes that run through these letters and are exhibited in several of the different letters. And then finally, our last time, I want to look at an antidote to Screwtape's wiles and what Lewis might say about how we can protect ourselves against various forms of temptation. So that's where we're going to go. So first, let's look at some background to the Screwtape Letters. Lewis came up with the idea for the Screwtape Letters as he was leaving his church, Holy Trinity in Headington, after a Sunday morning service. I can't help but wonder what that sermon must have been like that particular Sunday morning. The concept for the book, as many of you already know, is that there is one devil, a senior devil named Screwtape, writing letters to his nephew Wormwood on how to trip somebody up, tempt them, and cause them to, one, not come to faith, or if they come to faith, how to stumble. Lewis was going to write a sequel to this book and felt it only right that he do so. He was going to write a book featuring an angel who's writing to a nephew angel on how to elevate and encourage somebody else. But Lewis gave up on the idea, realizing that it's easy to get into the mind of the diabolical and virtually impossible to get into the mind of the angelic. Lewis had written this: "I had, moreover, a sort of grudge against my book for not being a different book, which no one could write. Ideally, Screwtape's advice to Wormwood should have been balanced by archangelical advice to the patient's guardian angel. Without this picture of human life, it's lopsided. But who could supply the deficiency? Even if a man, and he would have to be a far better man than I, could scale the spiritual heights required, what answerable style should he use? For the style would really be part of the content. Mere advice would be no good. Every sentence would have to smell of heaven." Who could ever write that second book, you see? But Lewis actually did do a sequel, and I see you have my friend Marge Mead coming to speak about that particular book. It was Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. But it's less pretentious because it's one spiritual struggler writing to a friend, fiction letters again, that form, but writing to a friend as two pilgrims are making the walk, trying to grow closer to Jesus. But how could anybody, the real question would be, become a truly authentic person even? How do we? It opens up all kinds of discussion for us. How do we become an authentic person? Years ago, John Stott came to Wheaton College. It was the last time he came to speak to the students. 2,500 gathered into Edmund Chapel to hear him speak. He spoke for 15 minutes and fielded questions from the students. One student said, "Dr. Stott, how do we reach the postmodernists for Christ?" And Dr. Stott gave a very tight definition of postmodernism and deconstructionism. It was that simplicity, the other side of complexity. My experience is more people talk about postmodernism than actually read about it. It's like the student who was once asked, "Have you ever read War and Peace?" And he said, "No, but I wrote a book report on it once." And then Stott said, the way to reach the postmodernists for Christ is to be an authentic person. And as soon as he said that, I went into existential despair. Because I'm not an authentic person. I believe in the high ideal of love, but I've had sharp words of people I say I love most in the world. I believe in justice, but there have been times I've been unfair in my treatment of others. I didn't set out to be, but realize in retrospect I had. How do you become an authentic person? As I shuffled out of the auditorium, I started thinking to myself, you know what, I think maybe there's only been one. Only one person could say, I have lived my life the way it was intended to be lived. As Pascal said in the Pensée, not only do we know God through Jesus Christ, we know man through Jesus Christ as well. And so we look at him, and the question begins to change. How does an inauthentic person begin to approximate authenticity? And I think it's by being honest about our inauthenticity. And when C.S. Lewis writes the Screwtape Letters, he holds up a mirror and allows us to see ourselves as we are, and allows us to begin hungry to enter into that realm of authenticity where we see our great need, and it sends us questing for the one who can meet us at the place of our desperation. Lewis's remarks in the preface to the second printing of the Screwtape Letters would vector us in that direction. He said, some have paid me an undeserved compliment by supposing that my letters were the ripe fruit of many years' study of moral and ascetic theology. They forget that there is an equally reliable, though less creditable, way of learning how temptation works. My heart, I need no others, showeth me the wickedness of the ungodly. You have to appreciate the humility of that comment. And this comment actually underscores Lewis's excruciating honesty as he writes these letters, and also how painful it is to read them. At least that's my experience. I don't know if it's yours. For in the letters, Lewis holds up the mirror of what Tolkien called scorn and pity, which is always the mirror that should be held up to humankind. Scorn because of our fallenness, pity because of the dignity of having been made in the image of God, and yet so deficient in that area, yet hopeful because we can move towards growth in Christ when we acknowledge seriously our need and come to God, the place of grace. I'll talk more about that at the end of our time in this lecture. Lewis uses imaginative literature to communicate truth. And this is something that we see throughout the corpus of his work. In the preface to Screwtape Letters, Lewis observed, every ideal of style dictates not only how we should say things, but what sort of things we may say. This concept appears in many of Lewis's books. He writes in a preface to Paradise Lost, "It's easy to forget that the man who writes a good love sonnet need not only be enamored of a woman, but also to be enamored of the sonnet as a literary form." The sonnet and what the person wants to say somehow come together. Lewis says that he writes children's books because children's books said best what he wanted to say through those particular books. He's longing for the form that will work. And the letter as a literary form lends itself to advice giving. Not only that, these particular letters are in the form of satire. Now generally satire is a risky thing for an author, because the satirist is always looking condescendingly at the culture from which he or she comes and looks down as if somehow the author is above the fray. But Lewis writes a form of satire called satire manquée, which is always the reminder that the author himself is part of the problem. If you'll remember The Great Divorce that Lewis wrote, it's also a satirical book. Lewis finds himself in hell. And he finds himself on a bus to heaven, or at least the threshold of heaven. And he describes despicable people on this bus. And just as they get to the threshold of heaven, and the light of heaven comes streaming into that bus, Lewis looks down the aisle and sees the mirror in the front of the bus and sees his own face reflected back. That's the kind of satire Lewis writes. It sees the foibles, but it doesn't forget. It doesn't forget. Lewis also saw the value of the imagination as a means to speak of the spiritual life. In The Allegory of Love, the book that established his literary reputation, he noted that allegory has always been the literary form directed towards speaking of the spiritual life. In other words, the use of imaginative literature. The word definition is an interesting word. It literally means of the finite. We define a thing by virtue of its limitation and its function. I can talk about the book because the book can be distinguished from the podium, the microphone, the notes, and so on. A thing has to be small enough to wrap words around it in order to define it. But if that's true, how do you define God? If he's infinite, how do you speak of the infinite? And basically what we have to move towards is something very different. We have to move towards similitude. Jesus, when he's speaking of the kingdom of heaven, says, the kingdom of heaven is like. And Jesus himself used figures of speech, parables, stories, metaphors, and so on. Consequently, even the medieval scholastics spoke of the way of analogy to speak of God. And Lewis observed that getting to know God was like taking bearings on the bright blur. He gets brighter and less blurry. Walter Elwell, the theologian, said, all theological work is a work in approximation, and we seek better and better approximations. I tell my students, there are no last words about anything. They almost drift into existential despair at that moment. And I say, to say there's no last words doesn't mean there are no sure words. We can have a sure word about something, but we never have a last word about it. Any truth we know even can still be plumbed more deeply. It has applications we've never considered, and it can be understood in some sort of coherent relation with other truths. And so I think Lewis, with the use of the imagination to describe things of God and things of the spiritual life, helps us avoid the possibility of thinking we've got it all figured out in a formula. The story is a little more malleable, and so on. But Lewis uses the imagination, and there's always a possibility for abuse of the imagination, of course. In his essay, Christianity and Culture, Lewis says, the very road into Jerusalem can also be the road out. What did he mean by that? In James 1:17, we read that every perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. God is immutable, unchanging. He gives us gifts to woo him to himself. These gifts can never be replacements of God. Matter of fact, it will lead to a kind of idolatry if we do that. But God gives the gifts, and the gifts, as he woos us to himself, are roads into Jerusalem. But if we make idols of those things, they are the very things that vector us away from Jerusalem at the same time. So consequently, the imagination is a gift, but the imagination is a risky gift. It can be abused. We'll talk more about these kinds of abuses as we go through the letters and so